Hey, this is Adam, and it's been a while since I've done a portrait, so I thought I'd do kind of a quick one. When I say quick, this entire drawing took 7 hours, 7.5. We're going to compress this down into hopefully about an hour or two long video. I'm only going to be showing you the most important parts because I use a lot of these techniques over and over, so I'm going to show you how to do these techniques, and then we're going to blow through some of the more boring parts. So let me get into what I'm doing here real quick, and then we'll get into other facets of this. So I'm picking out parts of the main subject's hair that are the darkest, and I'm just laying in a very quick, very rough set of splotches with charcoal powder. Now, you don't have to use charcoal powder here. You can use extra soft charcoal and a Q-tip and just smear that in. You can see on the bottom left-hand side I have a big blob of extra soft charcoal that's on scrap paper. I can just rub a Q-tip in there and do the same thing I'm doing here. It's just this is quicker. Once I have that in, I'm going to start dropping in the background, and I'm just painting that in with a paintbrush. I'm making sure it's darker on the upper left and the bottom left, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the upper right and lower right so that there's kind of a glow that happens in here. I'm deviating a little bit from the main picture here, the reference photo. So once I have that in, I'm going to do hair just a little bit differently than how I normally do it. So I'm doing this for a reason. I think most artists try to just draw the hair in like one hair at a time, and it always to me looks unnatural. So I'm going to do the same thing here, and then I'm going to show you how I fix it and make it look more natural. It's still not going to look like hyper-realism type hair. If we were going to do hyper-realistic hair, I would be spending hours on this rather than, I think I spent a total of like 20 minutes drawing the hair. So what I'm doing is I'm taking extra soft charcoal right now, and I'm picking out the blackest shadows in his hair, and then I'm going to lay those in first. And then I'm going to go back with hard charcoal and maybe a little bit of extra soft, and I'm going to start doing the minor shadows, and then I will blend all that stuff in with a blending stump. And then once I've got the entire hair laid in, I will blend all that together with a Q-tip, one that's loaded up with extra soft charcoal, and it'll soften up the whole area and make it look a lot more natural. So while I'm doing that, I'll explain why I'm doing this drawing and what you can expect. So I was in between commissions, and I needed just a project that I could bust out really quick, just to keep myself amused. I am a fan of both the people that you see on the right. The guy in the top right is Greg Davies. The man peeking over the corner there is Alex Horne, and they are the hosts of a British, sort of like a game show called Taskmaster. It's a really funny show. Comedians basically do tasks that they make up, and the tasks are super weird, and it's just an incredibly funny show. The joke in this drawing was that they have a running joke on the show where Greg Davies, who I believe is 6'9", 6'9" tall, if not 6'7", but I think he's 6'9". He sits next to Alex Horne, and Alex is 6'4", I believe. And since Greg is so gigantic, he always refers to Alex Horne as little Alex Horne, even though Alex towers over most humans. So in this drawing, and just for my own amusement, I wanted to draw a portrait of Greg and Alex, and I'm doing it the way you see here on the right. I'm going to have Greg in the forefront, and then Alex is going to be in the bottom right-hand corner of the drawing, just peeking up over the top as if he's the tiniest man in the world. If you're a fan of Taskmaster, that makes total sense. If you're not, it may sound goofy. But that's what I wanted to do. I needed a portrait that I could bust out in 7-8 hours or whatever, and then something to show you all. And then I figured I could use it as a tutorial on how to do just the most basic of portraits. Now, if I were to be doing this as a commission, this would not be a 7-hour drawing. This would be a 20, 30, 40-hour drawing. Some of my other portraits have gone up as high as 80 hours, and those get extraordinarily detailed. But I can't really sell those because there are not a lot of people in my area or really even online who are willing to pay $2,000 for a portrait that took me 80 to 100 hours to draw. It's just not feasible. If my name ever got huge or the YouTube channel exploded or I got a ton of people on Patreon, then I'll spend more time doing like an 80-hour type drawing. I'll show you how I do those, and it's painstakingly slow, but the results are crazy. If you've seen my Patreon or pretty much any, my Twitter, pretty much any of the social media that I use, I always have a picture of Ian McKellen that I drew. That is an 80-hour portrait. It's one of the few that I haven't sold because I won't ever be able to sell it for what it's worth time-wise. And also, the reference photo that I used to draw it was taken by somebody else, and I don't feel right selling my drawing of that because it wasn't my reference photo. It feels like it's probably copyright infringement at that point. So it's probably illegal for me to sell it. I could probably give it away, but anyway, it's more of a representation of what I can do whenever I put a massive amount of time into it. This is kind of the opposite. This is kind of showing off a skill where I didn't sit and do this all in one day, but I could have. We could have just turned on Twitch and streamed all 7 hours of this drawing and had it done in a single sitting. These are the ones that I think have the most potential to sell because they do look realistic, but they're not time intensive. So you could sell a drawing like this if you've got the audience and you've got the clientele for, I don't know, anywhere from $300 to $500 would be pushing it. I could probably sell this for $250 to $300. Again, same problem with this. I didn't take the reference photo or anything like that. And it's just for my own amusement. I posted it on Twitter, and Greg Davies commented on it and made a joke. Alex Horne ended up clicking the like button within like 2 to 3 minutes of me posting it. The Taskmaster account ended up liking the drawing too. So, I got what I wanted out of it, which was to make myself laugh and to also make Greg and Alex laugh, which I'm hoping they did. So, but anyway, so we're going through the hair, and I'm just drawing it in this, just like I told you, the way I think most artists do it, where they're drawing in the hair little bits at a time. Now notice that Greg's hair is graying. On the sides it's way more gray. On the top it's way darker with little tufts of gray. So as I go down the hair, I want to make sure that I transition from a mid-tone gray into an almost white on the right and left hand sides. So to help me do that, I'm taking a Tombow eraser and I'm going over the stuff that I've already drawn, and I'm dropping in bright white highlights. Now, his hair is not bright white. I should have probably taken these reference photos and turned them into grayscale so that you could see a lot more closely what I'm seeing whenever I draw. Because what I do is I take reference photos and I drop all the color out of them, and then it's easier for me to match tones of black, grays, and whites because I'm doing a one-to-one comparison. You can do it without doing that. If you don't have the tools to do that, by the way, and you can't afford things like Photoshop, there's a program called GIMP that operates a lot like Photoshop, and it's open source. It's freeware. And so you can get that instead of Photoshop and not have to pay a dime for it and still do all the functions that Photoshop does, or at least most of the functions. So anyway, I'm just going back into the left-hand side of his hair with, I'm using hard charcoal here because I don't want dark lines. And I'm picking out little clumps of shadows, and you'll hear me mention this a lot during portraits. But I don't ever really draw single hairs. I'm drawing the shadows that are produced by clumps of hair. And so when you get 15 or 20 hairs that all clump together like they do naturally in life, they're going to cast a single shadow as a unit. And that's what I'm doing. Once I have those in, I just take a blending stump and I'm just blending all that together. And then what makes it look like hair is the direction that I'm blending. I blend in the direction that the hair flows. and it's naturally going to give these soft, subtle lines that go in that direction, and so we're kind of faking the texture of hair by doing that. So I'm going to go around the whole head, and I'm going to do this same technique, and then whenever I'm done, when I'm done with it, it'll look okay. I mean, it'll look, you'll see it and think, well, that's fine. I could leave it like that. And you could, but we're going to take it one step further, and I'm going to show you how to take the hair that if you draw it like I'm drawing it, I'm going to show you how to make it just one step closer to realistic with the simplest technique possible. And here you can see I'm going over all this area with a blending stump, and I'm starting in the area that's the darkest, and I'm pulling it into the area that's the lightest. And that way it makes a natural gradient. And that's the way hair typically does. It's darker in one area, then it has a gradient that flows into a lighter area. And a lot of times hair will have an interruption where it reflects a ton of light. And this area that I'm working on right now, that happens right above that main shadow. There's a little strip of hair that reflects more light than the rest of it, and that's what makes hair look shiny. So I'm just going to continue around that area, and whenever I get into the gray part of the hair, I'm dropping in less and less of these, I'm putting less and less pressure on it because I want that to be a lot lighter. Now, one of the things that I did change in this area is the background. So in the photo, the gray parts of his hair on the side are lighter than the background. The way I have this is I've lightened up the background quite a bit, and I want the hair to be a little bit darker than the background. And the reason I've done that is I want that background to look almost like it glows, because part of the joke is to make Greg look angelic here. And make him look almost godlike, because that's kind of the way he presents himself on the show, is this overseer, this entity that's above everything else. And then Alex is kind of like his servant, and like his little demon entity that he carries around with him. It's not literally that, but that's kind of the impression they pull off. So I wanted to do the same thing here and kind of make him glowy and look almost larger than life, almost supernatural. So I'm going back up into the main part of the hair with hard charcoal, and I'm starting to do what I talked about a minute ago, where I'm highlighting clumps of hair that cast a unified shadow. So we've done the main shadows, the ones that stick out the most, and now I'm going in for secondary shadows that are a little thinner, a little lighter, a little bit more spread out. And what I'm going for here is I'm not looking to exactly mimic his hair that's in the reference photo, but I'm wanting to get pretty darn close to it. I need the essence of that to be there. So we're going to speed through this real quick because it's more of the same, and if we sat here and watched, I would be explaining for the next 20 or 30 minutes about every stroke that I'm doing, and it's just the same thing we've already seen. So you can see on the right, I'm using a blending stump to lay a lot of that in and then switching to pencil, and that's because I need that area to be softer. Now with a Q-tip, I've loaded that up with extra soft charcoal, which means I've just rubbed it in that splotch that I have on the left to darken that up. And I'm going to start darkening his hair, and we're doing two things here. One, we're darkening the hair overall. And two, more importantly, we're removing every single pencil stroke mark that we've put in there when we started first drawing this hair. So we're making it softer and subtler, and we're making everything blend in to become more of a mass. Because here's the way I look at hair in a drawing. If I'm right up next to somebody in real life, we're talking like 3 feet away, I can see each individual hair, right? You can see all the way they've combed it. You can see straggler hairs coming out because you're really close. If you're further than that away, you stop seeing individual hairs and it starts looking like more of a mass. And the only hairs that are going to be defined once you get so far away are clumps of hair. So you're going to see the shadows that get thrown from those, little reflections of light that get thrown off of bigger clumps and whatnot. I try to mimic that in my drawings. The other thing that I try to do is I mention this a lot in my other videos too, but the further away from the focal point I get, the less detail I put into the drawing. So in a photo like this, or a drawing like this, the main focal point of this is going to be Greg's face. Mainly his eyes and his mouth are the two most interesting parts in here, especially the eyebrows. The further I get away from that, the less detail I'm going to put into the drawing, because it will force the viewer's eyes into the area that I want to be the focal point. Now, I don't want to strip out so much detail that we just scrub his hair in real quick and forget about it and make it an afterthought. But I also don't want to put in so much detail that the eyes are drawn to it and it becomes the point of interest. This has to be like a secondary thing that they notice. If we wanted to make the entire drawing a focal point, which I think is a mistake, but if we wanted to do that, we would spend the next, well, like I said earlier, probably anywhere from 1 to 4 hours on his hair, and just painstakingly go over it and over it and over it and make it sharper and more defined and more realistic. And then we'd do that to the entire drawing. That's kind of the way I did some of my bigger portraits. They got big on like Reddit and Twitter and whatnot. But so now that I've got that put in with a Q-tip, this is the fun part, I think. I'm taking a really sharp eraser. In this case, it's a Tombow 2.33 millimeter eraser. You can use any eraser that you can put a sharp point on, even a kneaded eraser. And I'm just zipping over his hair and dropping in bright white highlights. And that is, I'm not erasing the whole thing. I'm just basically drawing them as if I'm drawing single hairs. And that's going to lighten that whole area up and start to make it look more gray than what it is right now. Now, the other thing that's going to make this look gray is when I start to put in his skin tone. I'm going to be comparing the skin tone to the hair that's around it. And if I make that dark enough, then the hair on the sides is naturally going to start looking whiter by comparison. But before we even get to that, the big thing that I need to do is drop in these highlights and reflections with an eraser. And that's going to make these things kind of stand out and give it more texture and definition. If I were going for what we were talking about a minute ago, hyperrealism, or just, a lot more photorealistic than what it is now, I would be doing the layer that you've seen, the layer that you're watching right now. Then I would go over all the hair again and give it another layer of refinement with pencils and Q-tips and blending stumps. And then another layer of highlights with the Tombow eraser. And I would continue doing that until it looks like you can see exactly how he combed his hair. Like it would look like you could run a comb through it. That's not what we're going for, but that's the way I'd do it if I were going to commit that amount of time to it. At some point, we will do a drawing that has that level of detail. The problem is, when we do that, it's going to be, if I have 80 hours worth of video, or let's say we don't even have that much. Let's say I've put 50 or 60 hours into a drawing like that. Distilling that down into a video that's 2 hours is going to take, we'd have to break that up into like a 4-part, maybe 6-part series. And a lot of those parts are going to be just really boring videos of me drawing in fast motion, some really tedious stuff. So I have to kind of figure out the mechanics of how to present that. So let's get into the most interesting part for most artists, especially beginning artists. This is the thing they like to do the most because it is the easiest thing to do, and it's the thing that looks the best when you're done, and that's the eyes. So the way I start pretty much every eye is I almost always start by outlining the pupil first, and then I make a light outline around the iris, because those things proportionally have to be dead on. If these things are off by even a few millimeters, it will change the way they look and make them look lopsided. So I usually throw in a very light outline with hard charcoal first, and then I will start adding in the actual the bulk of the shading and stuff like that afterwards. But this is kind of a test run, and in this case I'm even outlining the shape of his eyelids and all that too, just to make sure the proportions are correct. Now, while I'm doing this, take a look at the reference photo on the top right. Greg's right eye, our right, Greg's left, is slightly off. I have the same thing in my eyes, where one eye slightly looks off. It's almost like lazy eye. We don't want to get rid of that. We don't want to straighten the eye out because it will change the way he looks. Alex Horne has the same thing. You'll notice our right, his left, his eye is just slightly off. And I don't know whether that's because that's the way their eyes look in real life, or whenever you're looking at a camera, maybe your eyes just do kind of oddball things. It's not enough to make them look like they've got a lazy eye that goes all the way to the side, but it is slightly off compared to the left eye, our left eye. I want to make sure I keep that in there, but we want to point it out because whenever we get to drawing that right eye, we're going to be tempted to correct that and to straighten it out because we don't want people to think that we don't know how to draw eyes proportionally. You need to fight through that because if you're going to do photorealism, you're drawing what you see. And if we start inferring detail especially on a portrait, we're going to change the way they look in real life, and it's not going to come out worth a crap. Now, right here's another section where you need to be patient because, so I just did this quick outline, and I'm basically outlining where all the shadows are, and right now that looks nothing like Greg Davies. It's only going to start looking that way once we start throwing in the shading and we start manipulating shadows. And so once I have this outline done, now I'm going to go back in with extra soft charcoal and fill in the pupil. I want to use hard charcoal to fill in the eye, the iris itself. Now I'm going to leave a little bit of dead space right in the middle, negative space, for the reflection. We're not going to modify that with, an eraser or anything like that if we can avoid it. We're just going to leave negative space to represent that. It's the easiest way to do them. You can tell I'm taking my sweet time while doing this too, because I want the eyes, I think, are the most important part of a whole portrait. If you get these wrong, then all your work's for nothing. And it's kind of the same way. The mouth is probably the second most important thing about a portrait because those are easy to get off too. And then the nose would be the third. The whole shape of the face is important, but the nose would be the third most important thing because it's naturally going to be kind of a focal point, and it's difficult for a lot of beginning artists to figure out how to actually do the nostrils without making it look like they have hard edges on them, how to make the shadows fade into the curve of the nose versus the side of the face or the side of the cheek. So anyway, we'll get into all that in just a little bit. The important part here is that I make sure that the tones and the shape on the eyes are exactly as correct as I can get them. And I always throw in an outline. I always start out with an outline on all these things, but the outline is rough. So what I do whenever I'm re-outlining these is I'm modifying these and making them as close to the reference photo as possible. The rough outline just gives me an idea of like, here's where the eye goes. And then whenever I do a more modified version of that, like you see me doing here with the eyelids, that's refining it and saying here's how the eye is shaped. And we'll get a much more accurate, detailed view of the eye from that point. Now, while I'm finishing up these little areas, what I'm doing here is just cleaning up the edges of the iris. One thing to keep in mind is the whites of the eye are never white. Almost never, unless you've got a really, really bright light on them in the reference photo. The whites of the eye are almost always gray, and sometimes they're as gray as the skin tone around them. If you were to find this picture on Google image search of Greg Davies, just put in Greg Davies and then change the size to large. It'll be one of the first ones that comes up. In fact, I don't even think you have to change the size to large. Just look for this image. Throw it in Photoshop or GIMP, suck the color out of it, and then just look at the drawing or the reference photo and notes the whites of his eyes compared to his skin. And in fact, if you want to take like an eyedropper and just drop that into the whites of his eyes, I think you'll be shocked at how gray those parts actually are. So just keep that in mind, because if you start doing the whites of the eyes as gray as they need to be, sometimes that's going to tell you that the pupil and the iris is not as black as you need them to be, because by comparison, the whites of the eye are going to make the pupil and the iris look lighter. So here I'm taking a blending stump, and I'm dropping in kind of like, I don't think it's eyelashes below there. Part of it is eyelashes, which Greg Davies has very, very short eyelashes. And on the top of his eye, he either has none or they're just embedded in shadow to where you can't see them. But I'm dropping in those lower ones with a blending stump because they're very soft and very subtle. And so we're just dropping those in just to get them in place, and then we'll end up modifying that with everything from a Tombow eraser to hard charcoal to maybe even a light graphite, just to kind of accentuate them a tiny bit. And then as we go up into the ridges of the eyes themselves, we're going to need to probably drop in the eyebrow and then the ridge of the eye, the upper ridge of the eyelid right underneath that, so that we can start to get the shape of his face and to get the character of his actual eye correct right off the bat. Because if we don't get these correct, again, we're wasting our time. We'll get 3/4 of the way through the drawing, realize it doesn't look like him, and then we either have to make excuses as to why it looks bad or throw it away. I personally throw them away. So to get the ridge of the eye, I've dropped it in very lightly with hard charcoal, just enough to give it a bit of a line, and then I'm softening that up with a blending stump because this area has no hard edges. I don't want that to look like it's a line that's drawn in. I need it to look like it fuzzes out on the sides, because that's the way shadows do in real life. Pardon me, I've got a bit of a cold. I'm gonna grab a drink of tea real quick because I'm a tea fanatic. All right. So I'm blending the ridge of the eye down into the eyelid. And on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the eyelid, it's darker than in the middle. And that's because since the eyes protrude outward naturally, and they've got that little spherical curve to them, the very middle of that's going to pick up more light than the sides. And so it's going to be slightly more reflective there. Now, it still doesn't look like Greg, right? It still looks like a generic eye. It looks like a computer programmer made eye 2-B45, and it's not quite looking like him yet. Don't worry, we're keeping true to the shapes that we see, and as we add more detail, it will start to look more and more like him. So before I get up into the eyebrows and before I get too much further into this drawing, I want to lay in the second eye in order to make sure that we're still on target. So again, if I draw this eye, then I go up and get the eyebrow, then I get the forehead, and we start working our way from left to right in its entirety, meaning we're getting all the drawing done from left to right. If we get all that done, and then we mess up the positioning of the second eye, we've just ruined the whole thing, and he's going to look like Sloth from the Goonies. So I want to put this in first because it's the most important part of the drawing. So again, I'm doing what I did on the first one. I'm going to drop in the pupil and the iris using, this one I used a combination of extra soft and hard, and that's just because I was being careful. And then I'm going to blend that out with a fine point blending stump, and then I'll go back in and clean that up with a Tombow eraser just a little bit, just enough to harden up the edges. And then I'll go into the things like the edges of the iris, the outline of the eyelid. We'll start making the shapes out of the corners of the eyes. That's an important area of the eye that I don't think a lot of artists or art teachers bring up very often. The corners of the eyes, especially where the tear ducts and stuff like that are are really important because those will actually dictate the shape of like the football shape of the eye opening itself. If we get that too far into the white of the eye, it's going to make the eye look narrow. If we don't draw it far enough, it's going to make it look too wide, and everything is going to look lopsided and weird. So whenever I get into the corners of the eyes, I take my time and make sure that I get that shape and that size correct proportionally. And I don't know how to teach that other than you just have to practice it a lot, and then it'll eventually become muscle memory. Well, it'll become muscle memory for you to look at a reference photo and just know how to make that size correct. Now, one of the comparisons that I usually give myself to make sure I'm on the right track is typically the little ball of inside skin or tear duct or whatever that is on the corner, the inside corners of the eyes. Typically, you can directly compare those to the size of someone's pupil. And like on some people, that corner of the eye will be the size of their pupil. On other people, it'll be half the size of the pupil or whatever. But the point is that direct comparison can give you an idea of how to correctly make that little ball that happens in the corner of the eye. Other than that, I don't know how to compare it, to teach you how to get it correct. So now I'm moving on to the iris. And I'm dropping that in with hard charcoal, and then I'm going to blend that all together with a blending stump like I do all the rest of my stuff. Now, keep in mind that on this section, I am not worried too much about the shading, meaning the darkness or the lightness of this eye. I'm not worried about the tone, the contrast, or anything like that. I'm going to get it as close as I can to the original, but then later on in the drawing, I can always come back and add darkness to the eye, or I can lighten things up with an eraser or whatever. I'm mainly worried about shape. I bring this up all the time in my drawings. In every video, you'll hear me talk about that. I'm more worried about shape than I am tone, because once the shape is in place, that's extremely difficult to change, to modify, to correct. However, shading is way easier to manipulate. So especially if the shading is, or the correction is that I need to darken this area up. That's the easiest thing you can do in a drawing like this. Little bit more difficult to lighten things up, because then you have to be precise with an eraser and precise in your pressure and the areas that you use it in. At some point, if I make a big mistake, I'll show you how to do that too. But the thing that's really difficult to change and modify are the actual shapes, especially if you make them too small. That means you've got to erase the outlined edges and hope that you can get most of that stuff erased away without damaging the paper and causing it to shred. So anyway, all of that boils down to explaining why I'm taking so much extra time and care with every single stroke that I make on these eyes. And remember, the right eye is slightly off compared to the left eye. And anytime I mention this from here on out, we're talking about our right and not his right. So the right eye, from our perspective, is slightly looking not straight at the camera. It's slightly off. If we get that too far out of whack, he's going to look like he has lazy eye. So that is pretty subtle. And the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong is mere millimeters. Like 1 millimeter can make it look completely wrong. So you'll see me going back in with a Tombow eraser from time to time, and that's typically used like whenever I'm shading in or I'm blending in with a blending stump. I'll sometimes go right outside of the lines, just barely, because it's almost impossible to stop those at a sharp edge. And so what I do is I would rather go a little farther outside the lines and then erase my way back in to sharpen that up, because that means that the inside things that I've shaded will be more uniform in their covering. So I just made a couple small corrections on the left eye. I'm going back into the right again with a blending stump, and we're taking care of things like the upper part of the eyelid, and we'll start to do the same thing with the lower part of the eyelid. We're doing this with a blending stump in order to give ourselves a starting point. And also remember, I mentioned earlier that his eyes don't end in eyelashes the way most people's do. His eyelashes on the bottom parts of his eye is very subtle, almost non-existent. And if his eyelashes are there at all on the top, they're either extremely small or they're right in the middle of a very thin shadow and they can't really be seen. So the easiest way to do that is to drop this stuff in with a blending stump first and then work our way out. And then if we need to refine that a bit more later, we can. You can see here on the drawing that we've gotten so far, his eyes do look lopsided, and that's because we don't have the ridges put in. We haven't drawn in the corner of his eye yet. We haven't put in the top ridge of his eyelid yet, and once we start getting all those shadows in place, his eyes will start to center up quite a bit because we'll then have direct one-to-one comparisons. As opposed to, like, if we were to just draw the eyes and nothing around them, they would always look weird. They would always look off-center because there's nothing to compare those to. Especially since Greg is making that serious raised eyebrow face. It slightly repositions the right eye in our position from our perspective. Because he's raising that eyebrow, it pulls a lot of the eye upward. And it's going to make it look just slightly misshapen. But that's also the most interesting part of this drawing. Is going to be the eyebrows and then the crooked kind of smile he has on his mouth. Those are going to be two really interesting points. So I'm going back into this with hard charcoal. I don't want to use extra soft here because that would make too black of a line and it would make it look like he's drawn on like 1920s mascara or eyeliner, and we don't want that. We just want the appearance that there's a darker shadow there, so I'm using a pretty light touch. You see that I've also dropped in the little ball that happens in the corner of his eye, very lightly, and then also with an extremely light touch, I'm going to blend that away, the stroke marks away, with my sharp blending stump, a sharp pointed blending stump. Now the eyes still look crooked here, but again, we haven't added shadows yet or anything like that, so once we start modifying those things, his eyes are going to straighten up, and it's almost kind of like a magic trick when it happens. So now I'm going to grab hard charcoal, and now we're going to start putting in the ridge of his upper eyelid above his eye. I changed pencils there, I think, to a darker version of hard charcoal. So I mention this a lot in my videos too, and I'll continue to do it until this pencil is no longer usable, which will be soon. I have a couple different hard charcoal pencils. One of them makes a lighter mark, and one of them makes a much darker mark that's on par with like a medium grade pencil. So I use both of those to my advantage. The longer pencil makes a lighter stroke, and the shorter one makes a much darker stroke. So anytime I'm in an area where I don't want it jet black, but I want it darker than, just a light gray, I'll use that hard charcoal that makes the darker mark, if that makes sense. If you don't have pencils that do that, which you likely do if you own more than one hard charcoal, just use a medium pencil in place of the one that I just explained. Hopefully that makes sense. It basically boils down to no two hard charcoal pencils make the same mark. Some of them will make marks as dark as a medium pencil. Some of them make marks that are so light they look like H graphite pencils. So you really have to try them all out on a drawing to make sure, or at least on scrap paper, to make sure you know what kind of mark those are going to leave whenever you get onto your main drawing. Otherwise, you're going into it blind and you don't know if it's going to make a mark that's too dark or too light or whatever. So now I'm going back into the corner of his eye, and I'm really putting a lot of care into making sure that the shape and the size of that is correct. And yet now you can see his eye is starting to take shape, and it's starting to pull inward a little bit to where it doesn't look so crooked. Now this still doesn't look like Greg because we don't have the ridge of the nose in, we don't have the eyebrows in. It looks like a generic person that we're drawing right now. But once we start to put in shapes like the eyebrows and whatnot, it'll suddenly become Greg. So I guess the reason that I mention that is I think a lot of artists, especially beginning artists, don't look at this as I'm drawing one eye. Now I'm going to draw another eye. Now I'm going to draw an eyebrow. They look at their drawing as an overall entity. They think I'm drawing Greg Davies. They look at his entire face, and I think that's a mistake. And in fact, I get so into the details whenever I'm doing these that I don't even think I'm drawing an eye. I think I'm drawing a black circle whenever I'm drawing the pupil. When I'm going into the iris, I'm drawing a dark gray circle. Whenever I'm drawing the eyebrow, I'm drawing like a strip of shadow, and then I'll modify that to look like hair. So I never really think of I'm drawing an eye. I'm mainly drawing shapes and different gradients and different shades and tones of gray, black, and white. And I know that sounds really robotic, but that's the way I've learned that it's easier to do the drawing and keep your motivation, because at no point am I really looking at Greg Davies as a whole and the reference photo and comparing it to what I've done as a whole on paper. Now I will start doing that as I get more and more work put into it. So after I have the eyes, the eyebrows, the mouth, a little bit of the nose put in, then we start to get the drawing to look more like him. At that point, I'll look at both my drawing and the reference photo as a whole and compare them directly and say, what's wrong here and how can I fix it? Why doesn't this look exactly like him, and how can I make it look exactly like him? That's when I start doing that. I think that if you start doing that right off the bat, you're going to get really frustrated really quickly, because what you're drawing in the beginning is in no way going to look like your reference photo, because there's no direct comparison on the page yet. So all that being said, I'm dropping in the first eyebrow now, and I'm kind of doing something I usually warn against. I'm kind of drawing in individual hairs here, even though that's not really the way his eyebrows look in the reference photo. The reason I'm doing that is because when this drawing or this reference photo is in black and white, his eyebrows have several points of shadow that are darker than the rest. So it's not really that I'm drawing in individual hairs there. It's I'm drawing in long, thin shadows that are darker than the rest. Then I blend all those together with a blending stump. Then I dirty up a blending stump with even more extra soft charcoal, and I start using that stump as a pencil. And I'm just going back through and putting in darker and lighter shadows in different areas, because those are what's going to define him, and those will be too sharp looking if I did them with pencil. So I put in the base layer with blending stump first, because it's going to give it that natural, soft, faded edge feel, because most shadows don't just stop with a hard edge. They have a gradient and they kind of fade into other things. A drawing like this flows. All the shadows flow into light reflection. And so that's why I'm using a blending stump to do this. Now just that quickly, even with just a partial eyebrow put in there, the left eye is suddenly looking like Greg. It amazes me, even after all these years, that something minor like that and something that's that quick to do can completely change your perspective on how the drawing looks and how it compares to a reference photo. So once I have that eyebrow in place, and this is just the most basic part of the eyebrow, I'm just going to jump out around the edges of the eye and put in the most basic minor shadows, which are going to represent like the little lines that happen in the corners of his eyes. I think they call them crow's feet or something like that. Pig knuckles. Well, I'm not sure what they call them. But those lines that exist on the corners of their eye, are often surrounded in more gradiated type shadows like this. So I'm just going to drop those in with a blending stump, and I'm not looking for detail here. This is just the very first base layer, and then I'll go back in later on in the drawing and start to refine and sharpen those things up. The only part of a drawing that I take a lot of care and time to get right the first time are going to be the eyes and typically the hair. But even those, I will go back in later on in the drawing and do even more definition and even more refining to make those look sharper and darker and more defined and crisp. By the way, I hate the word crisp. I don't know why. I've always hated it since I was a kid, and it's one of those that I have trouble even saying, even though I know it's the word that's the best to describe what I'm talking about. I have weird words like that that bother me. Delicious is another one. I don't know why that word bothers me a lot. It probably also would help to know that I'm autistic. I got diagnosed like 3 years ago, 2017, I think it was, after a lifetime of wondering why I thought the way I thought and saw things the way I saw them. Even this may, I don't know, this may be interesting, it may not be, but even speaking in this tone of voice the way you're hearing right now is something that I learned how to do over the course of 46 years. I learned how to use this kind of inflection to speak normally, because my normal voice around people that I don't know, especially groups of people, is very soft, and it's very difficult for me to speak to people using this type of a tone and all that. That may be only interesting to me, but anyway, I don't know why I said all that, but I did. So there you go. It's now in your ear holes. So I'm jumping out on the outside of the eyebrow into the middle of his forehead, like right across the bridge of his nose. And I'm putting in a very basic quick shadow. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. The reason I'm putting it in there is because it's an extremely important part in defining his expression. The tilt of the eyebrows does that to a certain extent, or even mostly. But that tiny little crease that happens where the eyebrows kind of meet in the middle, or the forehead meets in the middle, those are extremely defining of an expression. So I just wanted to throw that little dot of a shadow in to get it in place. That way I know later when I start putting in the skin tones and all that, that's an area that will catch my attention because I put that mark there, and then I can define that a little bit later. It's more of a landmark to help me remember where to go and what to refine. So while I'm there, I drop down to the bottom parts of his eyes, and there are a couple of really defining shadows that happen here. They're not dark. I don't want to make them so dark that it looks like he has bags under his eyes, because he doesn't really have bags under his eyes. But these will help define kind of the depth of his eyeballs. It'll also help push out any reflections that happen here and around them. So I'm throwing those in very, very lightly, and you'll see how light they are compared to the rest of the drawing once I start putting in these really dark shadows in his forehead and in his cheeks and all that. They look dark now, but trust me, once I start putting in the rest of the shadows, those will lighten way, way down. To the point that I even will have to go back in and darken this entire area once I start adding in more shadows in his face. So that brings me to what I mention in every video, and I will continue mentioning until I stop making videos. I always compare what I'm drawing to what I've already drawn. And so what I mean by that is I've drawn this entire left eye in right now, right? And it looks okay. But when I start drawing other parts of this, the shadows in the face and especially the suit, that entire left eye is going to look so light, it's going to look unfinished. You'll see what I mean when we get up there. It'll look like I've actually lightened up the camera in order to make it look lighter, but I swear I didn't. It's just an illusion. It's a thing your eyes do. The reason that it's going to do that is because right now that eye is sitting on pure white paper. But once I get shadows in place on his skin, that's no longer going to be white, and we're going to be comparing that eye to gray paper and black paper. Once I get the suit drawn in, we're going to be comparing that to a way, way darker area, and that's going to make it look even lighter by comparison. So once we get that in place, if you've never seen it before or you're a beginning artist, it'll blow your mind because it's an optical illusion that you can see happening in real time. We'll get to that shortly. We're I think about halfway through the video now. I was hoping to have this as an hour long, but I think it's going to be closer to hour and a half, 2 hours long. So I'm picking out some areas where his head has these little rolls and ridges. Everybody's forehead has them pretty much, except Johnny Smoothhead. He doesn't have one. I don't know if you've met him. He lives in Detroit. But we're bringing the eyebrow up into that ridge area, and then we have to start dropping in the ridges on his forehead in order to make it look like that eyebrow's pushed up enough to where it wrinkles the forehead. That's why it's important. If we just threw in regular everyday shading along the right-hand side of his forehead without putting the ridges, it's going to look weird and cartoonish. But since his eyebrow is raised on purpose, it's naturally going to make those little ridges appear and sharpen and have darker shadows than the rest of the ridges on his forehead. So the reason I'm talking about that while I'm doing this basic eyebrow work is because I have to keep that in mind while I'm doing the eyebrow. Now, the way I made the actual eyebrow is I'm concentrating more on the shadow than I am the hairs, because this part of the face is more embedded in shadow than the other side of his face. Therefore, the shadows are going to cover up a lot of individual hairs in this eyebrow. So I drop that down in there with extra soft charcoal put onto a blending stump, then use the blending stump basically as a pencil to put in the beginning layers of this eyebrow. Then I can continue using that around the eye itself to start putting in secondary shadows, and those things are going to help define the eye, and it's also going to help define the spacing of the eyes, like how far they are from his temples, and it's going to define the shape of his face as far as depth goes, like the 3D depth of his face. These are the most important shadows, by the way. When you get around the cheek line, the jaw line, and the temples, if those are the same tones and shades as the rest of the face, his face is going to look flat and fat because we don't have defining darker shadows to make it look like his face has depth, and it goes back into the distance as you go around his head. So if you've ever drawn a face and it looks fat, even though you know the dimensions are right, it's probably because your outside shadows in your cheekbones, jawline, and temple, and especially the edges of the face, the shadows aren't correct. So right now I'm just kind of defining and refining his eyelid, the shadows that are around that right eye. I want to continue doing that, and I'm mainly working on shape here, which I am, but I'm also starting to get in, for the first time, I'm starting to get into making sure that the tones are kind of matching here, the way they do in the reference photo. So I'm trying to make this eye slightly darker than the other eye. It doesn't get real darker than the other eye until we get to the bottom right-hand section and then get into the skin that happens just to the right of his eye. But I'm trying to kind of throw that together in this section and start to work my way toward that, because if I don't get that right eventually, I'm going to end up with the problem that I just explained. His face is going to look out of place, fat, out of proportion. It's going to look two-dimensional. And the way that it looks three-dimensional is to get these shadows not only in the right spots, but to get them dark enough. So there's a nice big contrast between the shadow and the light. Now the same thing here is happening with the eye as what I explained with the hair. If I were doing this as a commission and not just a fun little project that I did for myself, I would spend probably, oh Lord, 3, 4 hours, maybe even 5 hours on his eyes, the eyebrows, and especially around the shadows that happen around his eyes. I would spend so much time there getting those exactly right before moving on with anything else. But since this is a project that I'm just doing for myself and my own amusement, I'm getting things as close as I can get them without spending several hours on this, because I don't want this to take up an entire week of my time. I just want to spend, 7, 8 hours on it, get it to where I'm happy with it, and then move on. I basically want it to look like Greg Davies and to look like Alex is peeking up over the bottom right-hand corner. And then I'm not worried about somebody looking at the drawing and saying, oh my God, I can't believe you did every individual hair on his eyebrow. I can't believe you went right down to the pores of his skin. I do that on commissions, but I don't do it on personal projects because I don't have that much time. So I'm doing even more refinement with a blending stump, and I'm kind of extending the eyelash area on the top of his the bottom ridge of his eyelid, because this eye is open just slightly more than the other eye because he's doing the eyebrow thing, and therefore the actual shape of this eye is slightly bigger than the eye on the left. And so I need to make sure that that's carried out in the drawing, that it comes through. This would be one of those places I mentioned earlier where it would be tempting for a new artist to infer size here and say these eyes don't match size-wise, so I need to make the right eye smaller or make the left eye bigger so that they match exactly. Human eyes don't do that. Most human eyes, one is slightly bigger than the other, one has a different tilt than the other, very subtly. And a lot of people, the eyes don't look perfectly straightforward. One pupil and iris set tends to be a little bit off center. Sometimes the eyebrows are not exactly perfectly even. If you're doing photorealism, these need to be reflected in the drawing. If his eye is bigger here, which it is, because his eyebrows being purposely lifted up, it naturally makes the top eyelid pull up with it, which makes the eye slightly bigger. It needs to be reflected in the drawing. And so I'm drawing what I see and not what I'm inferring that detail to be. I think that may be the biggest mistake that most beginning artists make, is they try to infer detail. Alright, so I think I'm going to actually break this up into 2 videos. This one's been going about an hour. I'm just finishing up this set of eyes right here, and I think that's a really good place to stop. So, yeah, let's do that. Let's break this up into 2-hour-long videos. I'm just blending out the final shadows along the ridge of his eye, and then I will start to define this entire area and move on to skin tones in the next video. So thank you so much for watching. Let's stop it here. I will see you guys next week with my second and final video on how to draw Greg Davies and Alex Horne right in the face. Thank you so much. I'll see you on the next video.